Hello. In today's interview, we will each be discussing different parts about colonialism in Mali and Somalia. So, for a little context, Mr. Dignan, can you just give us a little history about colonialism in Mali and how it was introduced to the area?
Yes, of course. By 1892, Mali was under the control of France, and all the major forces of rebelling in that region were halted by 1898. So it was relatively peaceful. By 1898, all the rebel groups were halted by then, and there was much positive development under France's rule, and the economy grew a significant amount. And Mali was grouped into French Sudan, which is a lot of kind of French West Africa. It was a large colonial state, much of West Africa, and it was mostly a peaceful transition for the natives because France gave a fair amount of control to the native administration.
What about Somalia?
So Somalia went under the control of the British, and it was called the Protectorate of Somaliland. Also, Ethiopia took a large portion near because they border each other, and Somalia was a much harder conquest for colonists than Mali because of these uprisings that last for upwards of 20 years.
And you also happen to be our expert on Islam in Africa. How was that religion introduced in Mali and Somalia?
Well, Islam has existed in East Africa for around 1500 years, ever since the area opened up to a large amount of these Arab traders that came in. Africa let open this large influence of Arab traders, and that was about 1500 years ago. And ever since then, East Africa has been more and more influenced by Islam. And in Mali, it was also something of that sort. There were Arab traders that came in around 1,000 years ago, so 500 years later than in Somalia, and the Muslim traders ventured into the West Africa and introduced Islam, and there the introduction of Islam into the government was very subtle.
Then, in the future, what happened in response to colonialism?
Well, that was a huge problem, adapting Islam to colonial rule after Christianity had been pushed into many areas of Africa. There was one idea in Somalia to completely oppose westernization and to return to orthodox Muslim traditions. An Islamic inner sect called Sufism was the main supporter of this movement, and overall, most Islamic leaders opposed westernization and Western education.
Was that the only option the Somalians had?
No, so the other popular idea was to reform Islam and reinterpret it to adjust to colonial rule, and the supporters of Islamic reformation believed that Islamic teachings offered all the lessons people needed to adapt to Western education and modernization in a safe way. Muslim poets and writers produced pieces of work that reflected the need for Islam to adapt to modern society and to leave its old, menacing potential to bring down non-Islamic or the Western world. An Egyptian nationalist named Gamal Abdel Nasser was a religious leader to many Somalis, and he influenced their independence, and he was at the forefront of Islamic reformation, and he actually happened to overthrow the monarchy in Egypt, and that was also a great influence for Somalis.
What about Mali? How was the response in that region?
Ever since colonialism, Islam has needed to adapt. So when Christianity and Western education spread to Mali and Somalia, they both needed to adapt their religion in order to cope with westernization. People called this domestic Islam. During colonial rule, the religion was suppressed while modernization was becoming more and more popular. However, after colonial forces left in World War II, Islam took more of a foothold and was the basis of rebuilding in many places through Sharia law and having that culture as some point to return to. So having Islam as a basic culture point. And however, in most countries in Africa, Sharia law was not adopted, although in Mali currently between 60 and 80% of the population supports an Islamic state.
How would you say overall colonialism affected Islam?
I would say colonialism hindered Islam's spread. So many Islamic views contradicted Western modern views, and when European forces came in, it slowed Islam's progress. It was not that the two religions, Islam and Christianity, clashed at that time, because at that time Islam was a highly tolerant religion for the most part. It is that throughout history, Islamic nations and European nations have been fighting since the Crusades and before. One could say that Somalia and many other Islamic nations in that time were highly skeptical of the Western culture and rule. This participated in the uprisings in Somalia and how colonialism did not assist and spread Islam, but actually slowed its progress.
What happened after Mali and Somalia became independent? How was Islam affected?
After the European powers withdrew from Africa, many states became Islamic states. Not mainly Africa, but more in the Middle East, but many states became Islamic influenced states. Currently, Mali is not an Islamic state, like I said, although the majority supports it. However, after the Europeans left, Islam was allowed to expand and grow within the former colonies. In the present, Somalia is also not an Islamic state, and there's little to no former government there. However, after the colonial powers left, there was no longer direct conflict between Islam and the Western powers in the area, which allowed Islam to thrive and truly spread throughout Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Dignan, for that informative and thorough report on the spread of Islam in Somalia and Mali. When we come back, we'll be interviewing Professor Abby Holm, expert on the spread of Christianity in these areas. Stay tuned.
Hello, welcome back to the Africa Report. We're now going to be talking to Professor Abby Holm about the spread of Christianity. So, Abby, can you tell us a little bit about the spread of Christianity in Africa?
Well, today Christianity is essentially non-existent in Somalia. The vast majority practice Islam.
And why is that?
It's really interesting, actually. See, when the British first started colonizing Somalia after the 1884 Berlin Conference, there was a substantial amount of resistance from the native people. Mohammed Abdullah Hassan was an Islamic Somali during the colonial era who led a 20-year resistance against British, Italian, and Ethiopian forces. As a partial result of this, we now have Somalia with little to no integration of Christianity.
And how would you say that this compares to the country of Mali?
Well, we have about the same sort of situation as we do in Somalia. You could say about 90% of the population, at least, in Mali are Islamic.
How is that affected by European colonization?
The French began colonizing Mali around the same time as Britain did Somalia. Oddly, in establishing the colonial government through a system of indirect rule, where the Islamic leaders were used as the means to carry out French control, France actually helped further the spread of Islam in Mali. However, in turn, it indirectly led to bigger resistance when they did start to push for Christianity after they had firmly established the government.
Tell us a bit about the factors that play into Christianity when looking at these two countries today.
Well, it's important to take into consideration the fact that converting out of Islam is considered a crime in Somalia. You can even be charged with the death penalty for it. And because of this, a lot more Somali people likely follow and practice Christianity only in secret, making us not unaware of it.
And what about in Mali?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of people living in Mali follow Islam. Though, despite the obvious imbalance between the number of Muslims and Christians in Mali, the country is considered a secular state, and it is completely opposite to Somalia in that it allows for freedom of religion. However, after Sharia law was imposed in northern parts of the country, this particular area is less secular.
How does religion play into the amount of conflict found in the two countries today?
Well, from my knowledge, religion has more of a controversy in Somalia than in Mali, understandably so, with the law regarding converting out of Islam. Today we have a radical Islamic terrorist groups such as the Al-Shabaab who have targeted Christians in Somalia. You can see kind of similar situation in Mali as well, however, not as extreme.
Thank you, Professor Holm. We will have more after the break. Stay tuned. Hi there, for all your viewers just tuning in. Professor Noah Cohen, a PhD in African history with an emphasis on Mali and Somalian culture, is here to discuss the respective countries' cultures and traditions. Welcome, Professor. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we dive right in, tell me, what do you think is the biggest misconception about Mali?
Well, that's an excellent question. Many people, intellectuals even, talk about Mali as one coherent country. It's an absolute misconception, as Mali is composed of many ethnic groups. There isn't one specific Mali culture. Therefore, it is difficult to talk about Malian culture as a whole, considering every ethnic group has its own cultures and rich traditions. This, of course, is in stark contrast to Somalia, where the country is inhabited by one homogeneous ethnic group. Somalia is unique to other African countries in this respect.
And do different regions in Somalia practice different traditions?
Of course, every region has its unique quirks, but traditions in Somalia are fairly universal. The people of Somalia share a language, Somalian, which is spoken by over 99% of the people, And over 99% of Somalians also practice Sunni Islam. Therefore, they all share cultural practices heavily influenced by the faith. They also share their heritage with a common ancestor, so they are all ethnically the same group. The case is very different in Mali.
What ethnic groups reside in Mali?
Well, to name a few, Bambara, Tuareg, Dogon, Songhai, Senufo, and Fulani.
It seems that Mali is overall culturally divisive. Is there a lot of culture clashing as a result?
Not much. Malians are very easygoing about the myriad of cultures that make up the beautiful country, though one universal Malian tradition is cracking jokes about each ethnic group. They call it plaisanterie, or something like that. I'm not French. It's all in good fun.
That is a French word, isn't it?
Yes, French is the official language of Mali. I personally don't think that French should be the representative language. It's just one impact colonialization had on the country. Many people assume French is the official language because it allows the different ethnic and cultural groups to have a common language. This, of course, is false, as the Malians do, in fact, have a common language that they share.
So what language is this?
Bambara. It is spoken by around 80% of the people, even though it only represents one cultural and ethnic unit of the country.
And are there drastic religious differences among Malians?
No, not quite. Although there are those who follow Christian and traditional African belief systems, Islam is the major religion. Over 90% of Malians are Muslims.
What type of Muslims?
Most identify as Sunni Muslims.
And is there any conflict among the Muslims in Mali?
No. They practice a tolerant form of Islam. Furthermore, they are governed by a fully democratic system. The only conflict Malians are facing in regard to their religion is the threat of radical Islam that is attempting to infiltrate their country from outside their borders. Somalians face a similar situation. Islam in both countries is foremost a culture before faith. It affects every aspect of their life, from marriage to birth to death.
Good afternoon, this is Professor Dignan, here to wrap the show up. Thanks for coming by and watching the Afro Report. See you again sometime soon.